PP.
Is it okay if I share my screen?
I should have an E there instead of an A.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm like, it doesn't look right.
APPER.
That doesn't look right either.
That doesn't look right, does it? APPAREL. I think so. AREL.
There it is. Thank you. Oh, welcome. Sarah.
We good?
Everyone back, the soccer player.
Oh, did you read it?
Anticipation is killing me.
I looked at Nancy and
Oh, it was from my Abby?
it was,
Oh,
I was feeling lonely 10 minutes ago, by the way, because I was the only one here.
it's from Molly. Edson.
It's getting a
oh,
little-
but that is so funny. I know, but that
David's
looks
gonna
like
find
exactly
one
like how
bunch
my
more.
Abby signs her name. And my Abby's such a bookworm. And I was like,
Good.
what is this going on here?
So good evening. Welcome to the Ellensburg City Council study session. On our agenda tonight is we are going to talk about communications and public engagement. And ironically, there's no public comment in this section of the meeting. But we'll play that by ear.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Good evening. I'm Heidi Barron-Sternaway, City Manager, and I have with me tonight, and we're going to share our presentation tonight with Dr. Ellie Carr. She's our EPD analyst, and Dan Carlson from our community development. He's our director there, is going to talk a little bit about the regulatory environment when it comes to communications and engagement, specifically public hearings, public records. So just a reminder, we started this discussion and from time to time, I think we've done, it's been a couple of years now. I'm just talking about the communication tools that we have in our toolbox, and it's a good thing to revisit once in a while. And so this is from the Institute of Public Participation. This is basically the spectrum of engagement. And we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the spectrum from inform to empower. And these are tools that are standard in city toolboxes. Cities use these across the country. Other folks use those across the country to look at, what is our goal? When we met last time, when Nicole started this presentation, we really talked about the communication tools that we use. And those are the, tools we use to inform. So when we want to tell people something, here's how we get the message out to them. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about those in addition to how we actually engage with the public, some of the tools that we use in our toolbox and different ways that we use those. All right. So also in your packet tonight, I did include the Bloomberg Harvard program actually produces a number of city leadership tools. They look at best practices across the country for how cities and communities engage with people in their community. And so I think it provides a really great framework and set of best practices for anyone who wants to dive a little bit deeper into this topic. And so again, we did include that in the packet, and we'll talk about some of these principles as we move through the presentation tonight. So just to begin with, again, sort of the spectrum starts with how do we inform people when we start to ask questions about what do you think, and that's when we start consulting with the community members, involving them in decisions and in evaluating concepts, things like that, collaborating, and sometimes we ask folks in larger cities, sometimes you'll see like community planning that's actually done at a neighborhood level where you have people actually planning their own neighborhoods as well. So when we start with our public participation plans, and you'll be familiar with this, those who've participated in our comprehensive plan updates in the past, typically we start with an adopted participation plan. And what's important to planning is that we listen to the community and listen to their interests. And so typically the first thing we ask is why? Why are we doing this? what are our goals in this communication? Are we trying to, again, sometimes we are just trying to tell people what we're doing, to inform people of what activities are happening. And then sometimes we're trying to do deeper. So the tools that we use and the methodologies that we choose really depend on our goals. So starting with that why is incredibly important. The subject matter is going to change as well. Are we planning a park? Are we looking at our 20-year comprehensive plan where we're doing kind of a more comprehensive approach to getting people's input? It might not be just on one specific subject, like what is our water system? It might be on something much broader, like, where do you see our community? What do we want to be known for? What does our transportation system look like? Things like that. So the topic and the reason that we're doing the planning project or looking at a policy, all of that makes a difference on the tools that we choose. And again, who are our audiences? Making sure that we're listening and we're targeting the strategies that we use to communicate with people and to gather information from people based on where people are, or who might be possibly impacted by a decision that you make, a policy or a plan or a project. And then looking also at the tools that we use. We have a lot of tools in our toolbox, and just about anything is available for a price. When we initially looked at our sustainability and energy plan, the initial public outreach plan was more than half the cost of the entire planning project. And so when we're talking about an $80,000 to $100,000 community engagement plan, we sometimes have to decide, okay, what are our priorities and scale that back. Again, our communications, then the tools that we use are attached to resources, whether people or other costs, consultants or in-house as well. And then, and again, the timeline. Sometimes we have a short timeline, sometimes we have a longer timeline. So again, the tools that we choose and the approach that we take depends on all of these factors. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of a review of what Nicole went through last month. And that is sort of the communication tools that we have typically that communicate outward. Written things, we have flyers and handouts. We have newsletters, things like that. That again, depending on the type of project or plan we're looking at, we might use a variety of those. We have mailing lists, and typically for planning projects, we keep mailing lists. And I think about the critical areas plan. Anybody who contacts our staff in community development or other staff, we have lists that people can sign up on the website for specific topic interests. And so when the issues come up around those, folks actually get notified for those interested party mailing lists. We have a number of online engagement tools that we use. We sometimes use things like polls. Right now we have a poll open for what are your top priorities in the community, a way to measure the pulse of the community. We can do online surveys to crowdsource information. With one of our comp plan chapter updates recently, we did a crowdsourcing asking people to tell their stories. And this was a couple of years ago, and we didn't get a single person that wanted to share their story. So again, different levels of our different tools take different levels of engagement. And it means getting those in front of people in a way that they're willing to participate as well. So we have our website. Website these days are more like libraries. People go to them to find out information, as opposed they're generally not, pushing information out. Those things to push information out are generally through mailing lists, mailing things to people's houses, through social media to try to get people to be aware of issues that are going on. Again, planning projects, programs and policies that we're looking at. So social media has been, not everybody's on social media. It's not a one size fits all. And so making sure that we're trying to get people, push the information out, and we have resources for people to fall back to. And then we have very traditional media releases and noticing, some paid advertising sometimes we do to make sure people get, and sometimes we'll again mail things to people's homes with postcards letting them know about issues or surveys or things like that. All right, so some of the more interactive tools when we're trying to ask people questions and listen to what their answers and to inform or to move different projects. We use things like open houses and public meetings and during our parks planning, we've done open houses. We'll often do those during planning projects. Typically these, they require people to show up, and they tend not to be terribly well attended unless there's more of a controversial item that comes up. And then folks tend to show up more actively. And there's a fair amount of effort that it takes on the community members' part to show up to a public place and participate in a meeting, whether it's just listening to a presentation or providing input. And so we've found ways to interact with folks and to offer online options and Zoom options to participate as well. So we have some virtual options as well as in-person options to provide to people. Sometimes we go to where people are to get information from people. For the comp plan update a few years ago, we staged at the farmers markets and we went to community events. That can be effective, but it's not always effective. Sometimes people are very focused on the activities themselves and really aren't interested in talking about transportation costs. And then to do focus groups. It's one of the tools that we use as well, that sometimes it's helpful to sit down and get an in-depth, if on especially a complex issue, ask people questions and to get behind their thinking and their decision-making to help inform what elements of policy we might need to consider when looking at projects or policies and plans. And again, all of these apply to programs, projects, policies, plans. And stakeholder groups as well. Sometimes choosing different representatives from potentially different interests around the community and asking questions in order to inform what the issues and the interests really are and how we can go about addressing those and making sure we're hearing from people who may not be at the table. One of the An example would be when we did our sustainability and energy plan, part of our CETA requirements, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, requires us to listen to marginalized communities, people who might be impacted by policies, low-income families, and making sure that we had representation. And what we did was we actually did executive interviews with agencies and folks who serve people with, for instance, Central Washington Disability Resources, and other stakeholders to understand some of the elements and some of the concerns to make sure we heard from people who could at least represent the interests and the concerns and challenges that folks from those communities might face. We'll do sometimes online or in-person virtual interviews. And so again, these are tools that you can understand sort of more complex issues at a deeper level. We've also done things, and speaking of stakeholder groups, stepping back a little bit, when we initially started talking about streeteries, what we did is we pulled a stakeholder group together that represented businesses, that represented some of our internal staff, downtown business community members, to talk about what are the concerns and challenges and how can we best shape a policy around these things. And we've done that with a number of others. Most recently, I think we've been working on the ad hoc committee on homelessness, but also the flags and banners policy as well. So we often have one or two of those projects moving at any given time. And then public comments on opportunities. Sometimes they're in a community meeting where people can stand up. Not everyone's willing to stand up and wants to stand up in front of a large group of people or even a small group of people. So finding ways to hear voices too. Sometimes we use comment cards and try to track trends and people's comments in order to help inform and listen to community members to make decisions. And then again, polls and surveys. And when I'm finished with this, Ellie's actually going to talk a little bit about surveys and sort of how we choose between formal and informal surveys. There's science behind it, and the generalizability of the results really depend on the methodology. And then Dan's going to talk a little bit about public hearings and other ways that we get to hear from people in a more formal sense. Before I move on, any questions about any of these tools? Okay.
You mentioned cost. So what's the cost of adding a flyer to the utility bill?
Depends on printing. It's around $1,000, I believe.
And postcards to everyone?
It depends on where we send them. Postcards to everyone are actually fairly expensive. We can be in the several thousands of dollars, even for a black and white postcard to have those printed and mailed.
And the annual report that we send out.
It's about
That goes to everyone.
$6,000 to print and mail to every household. And again, the reason we do these is that we know that at least once a year, everyone in the community gets something from the city. And so we try to drive people back to our online resources, and we have our monthly newsletter so we can continue to get folks to sign up for things and have a better mailing list to get to more people.
Thank you.
So just as a point of clarification on the utility bills, that's becoming a less comprehensive issue as people move online. We're not hitting everybody.
That's correct.
Okay.
So yes, and so now we have paperless billing really truly available with our new system. And what we found before is that people who had their payments set up automatically were not reading their bills. And even when we made a payment system, we put bright stickers on the outside of the envelopes. And a significant number of those people did not read their messages either. So it's not 100%. And even when we mail postcards, we did that in West Ellensburg when we were doing the Rotary Park master plan update. We had folks who insisted that they hadn't received those as well. So it's really hard to get. This is a community, not just a community. It's a world we're in information overload, and to get people's attention and to help them pay attention to the things that come across their screens or even in their mail, it's challenging. It's challenging. Okay. Great questions. Thank you. All right, Ellie.
Thank you all again for having me back up here to also talk about something I'm passionate about, which is the process of research. So I was asked to kind of explain the different elements of survey because it seems like this combination word. So there's the reference flyer, which is hopefully could be a tool in your toolbox to work through. But the biggest thing that I would equate this to is the difference between using the Robert's Rules of Order versus just general discussion. Even though the topics that are covered in both areas may be necessary, may be important, may be significant, it's the process in which you do that and why we have those protocols. So for all of you in governance, and being able to use those Robert's Rules of Order to make sure that you have that, you cover every step, make sure you have every essence that is built into that. Of it's not just one person's opinion that's dictating everybody else, there is that representation. So when it comes to surveys, that's the difference. With a formal survey, you're looking at the whole entire scientific methodology that we use as researchers and scientists. And then you have the general informal, where a lot of people might equate that to when you click on Facebook and you want to find out what your sign or your color or your Harry Potter school that you want to apply to. So like all these things that as it looks into, even though it could be as simple as just asking a question, there's a lot that goes into that context. So with the informal, you can just ask a general question of what are your thoughts, feelings, emotions, and reactions. For a more formal, the things that are looked at is like the whole entire verbiage, the context, the placement, and even like the sequence that questions are asked in. So the reason why as researchers we look at this and it's much more convoluted is because you have to look at all the different types of biases that play into how people question it. Just today I was actually talking about testing and exhaustion, which is an effect where if you ask 76 questions like we did on our community survey for the EPD, you may have a little bit by the end of that survey. Somebody might be, I want to be done already. So it's like, how do you equate for that? So that's where that concept comes in. The biggest reason for the collection of surveys and why one would want to choose more of that formal aspect, even though it may be a little bit more laborious, is for three main reasons: the validity, reliability, and then generalizability. And I'll talk in that sequence. For validity, you want to make sure that the questions you're asking are really truly at the heart of what you're looking to do. If you're asking a question that is just too generalized, where you can have many different responses. People have strong feelings about many of things. They have past experiences that they're going to convey in the results. So you want to be able to make sure that their response is what you're looking for. As a previous teacher, I would say, You could do really well in math, but if that math test was put in Farsi, Hebrew, or even Chinese in Mandarin, you wouldn't perform as well. So it's one of those, like, how do you collect that in a more consistent, reliable way? And that's where reliability comes in, is that you get the same type of responses on a consistent basis. That's where the more mathematics comes in. You want to make sure that the norm of everybody that is represented in that is that it is very consistent. You can have some stronger emotions on one side versus the other, but you want to make sure that a majority of the responses are going to be in that distribution. That's where the statistics comes in. I was told to keep it short, so I will not get into stats. If you want to have a side discussion, I'm all for it. But the big thing for this is the generalizability. How do you know that your responses can actually represent your community? And that's where those protocols come into play. Not just how the questions were worded, how it was administered, being able to send out, if it's electronic or paper copy. Utility bills was something that we were talking about before for ours. And it's making sure that you have that representation. But you also don't want to stack the deck either. You don't want to have a lot of people who may be pro something and you push it out to them. That's why you cast the net wide and you hope, and the researchers standing on the by sweating a little bit, like, please respond. They start trickling in and you get really excited. And then you realize 1,000 responses means you have to analyze it. Big gulp, you could do it. But that the more numbers you have, the more representative that you have. So in short, what I hope that you take away from this is when you're deciding ultimately what tool you want to use to be able to garner the thoughts, emotions, responses from your community members, is look first at how serious of a topic is, having come from the federal side. Where does the money go and how much of it? Well, the more formal, the more money, the more formal. You want to make sure that you can have that to fall back on and answer to, saying, yes, this is ultimately what's going to be in best for our community, because you have that formal representation. If it's something that you're just trying to solicit brainstorming ideas, you don't have to go into that full formal. Asking questions like, what matters to you? Well, if you're going to action off of it, well, that's where you can generate more. But overall, just look at it in two separate ways when you're deciding what type of survey is the more formal versus informal. And obviously, we have tools in the toolbox as far as personnel who understand the formal, and we have many, many uses. The city already has ArcGIS with Survey 123, so we don't have to pay for a subscription for surveys, and the amount of data that comes into that can be quite expensive. So luckily, we already have that in place. So that is surveys in a complete nutshell. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those, or if you need more elaboration, I'll happy to meet with you later.
That took a whole quarter of my master's program, so that was awesome.
Ding.
Just one question. So can you generalize if you put a survey out there and you just let people respond? If you have a big enough sample size, is it generalizable, or do you need to have to make sure you get a cross section of people? Do you have to target people and get them to reply?
So I'm going to say kind of in a way, there are two elements that you need for generalizability. You have to have the numbers. So proportionally, what you want to do is you want to have it representative of your community. The other one is very much demographics. That's where it's one of those elements that you could see between formal and informal. Formal questionnaires, formal surveys will have demographic questions. If you don't have demographic, you cannot generalize to the general community, because you don't know if you are pulling from all representative from all different type of groups, whether it's ethnicity, housing, any age, any of the demographics that make us so diverse as a community. You have to make sure that you're representing that. The different ways that you can do that in analysis is, my preference is more correlation with census data, but that's why it's so important to capture that. So yes, you can be able to generalize the community, but you have to make sure that you have demographic data so you can ensure all those respondents are representative of everybody in the community.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the methodology and how important that is to generalizability too?
Very much. So it goes back to, I worked in many a type of organizations and groups. And I remember at a time when I was first learning about the Robert's Rules of Order going, why? It seems more tedious than not, but realizing through the process, it's more so important. When you have a formal and such like our survey, we went through the 100% full context of what is scientific research. So inquiry versus research. Research follows is a very strict 5-step process. And if any of those steps are overlooked or skipped or shortcut, that's where there's going to be a flaw in your results and you're not able to publish and share. And the whole idea is to be able to empower those around you with knowledge and information. Those steps must ensure, because especially with working with people, in my world, we call it human subject studies, which seems a little bit more scary, but that just means you have to care for the people that you're asking questions of. So we have protocols within science, within psychology. We have the American Psychological Association has a code of ethics. And here at CWU, they have what's called an institutional review board. I know this is big things, and I'm sure all of you completely understand this, but to make sure I'm jogging my memory, is that this is an oversight to ensure that we are following every ethical procedure to ensure that every participant, not only we retain confidentiality, but they feel safe enough to be able to answer as honest as possible. Because if you can imagine, some people ask questions in surveys that get to the heart of the very soul of a person. And it's a little bit unnerving to think that's going to be on blast. It's latest greatest. So these protocols are specifically in place. So you have to have your survey ahead of time. You can't do any last minute additions. You have everything in place, but before you hit go, that's where you take it as a pretty little package, hand it over to that board, which would be the IRB here, and they go through and they scrub to make sure that you hit all those marks. It's quite the application, but it is a necessary application because you want to make sure that not only are you protecting the people, protecting the data, protecting yourself, but also ensuring that when it comes time to presenting the information, you have strong legs to stand on because you know you've gone through those procedures. And then once that is complete, the data management of all the information, all the resources that went into it, maintenance and structure. So if you have anything that's hard copy, you have to retain that for a certain time period. And especially if you publish on it. So, and publication, and that goes into generalizability. It's not just academic journals. This means to educate the general public to extend beyond just the sample population that you have. If you pull a focus group together and you have a discussion with that focus group, and all you plan to do is share with that focus group, that's not really generalizing. That's just rehashing a discussion. But if you plan to take that focus group information and generalize it back to the community, that's where the protocol should be in place to make sure that everything was on par as far as step by step.
Thank you. And I would just say, I think the only formal survey we've done is the recent police community survey. Most of our surveys are informal surveys.
Do we have time for another question?
Absolutely.
So the DEI Commission does listening sessions with various populations from the disadvantaged and the multicultural communities. We have standard questions that we ask. We don't have a conversation. We just ask for their feedback. So everything we get is qualitative. Are there ways that we could make that more quantitative so that at some point after we've done, 6 or 7 groups from the Hispanic community, we could make some statements about that community relative to the questions that we're asking?
You very much can turn qualitative data into quantitative. It's a whole process. It's a theming and coding process. It's one of my favorites, actually. So
Cool.
throw that out there. But The challenge that you would have with that is, again, the demographic. You wouldn't be able to generalize beyond those groups specifically
Right.
to, like, if you have a focus group that answer these responses from the Hispanic community, you wouldn't be able to generalize entirely back to that unless you ensure you have that collected demographics, because there's even diversity within that group.
Yeah.
But there are definite ways to take those comments, as long as you don't say all of Hispanic community within Ellensburg think this, as long as you specifically state, based off the results, our respondents stated this, and this percentage, this correlation emerged from the information that they provided. It's one of those proper wording is very, words mean things, okay? That's a throwback to my information ops world, but making sure that you kind of like frame it in the right context. But yes, you can definitely take qualitative data and look at it in a quantitative manner.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Ellie. Dan.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Dan Carlson, Community Development Director. I'm going to talk a little bit about public hearings that require public notices. So this slide just lists a few of the many project types that our code contemplates. A few that require public hearings. There is a lot of them, but these are the ones that I think we probably see most often. Just kind of an example of what there is. And I included in it who the decision maker is and and including who makes recommendations on these things. So as you can see, there's a lot of different there are different process types, different decision makers and recommenders. And one of the main kind of distinctions here and what's up there is that there are some of these that are quasi-judicial in nature and some that are legislative. And so you have ones that are specific to a property. That comes with a higher, there are rights of the landowner, the applicant, the surrounding landowners that have to be protected through that process. And so you get a higher level of notification requirement for the ones that are specific to a site. And those would be ones like a conditional use permit or a plat or those kind of things. It's different than our legislative processes or like a comprehensive plan amendment that applies citywide or a rezone that applies to an area, but not specific to a site. You actually see that in the slide here. A site-specific rezone has a different process because it does require that notification than what the comprehensive plan amendment is. So for the slides that I have left, I'm going to focus on the site-specific application types and public hearings because they do have that higher level of notice requirement. Another thing is our code has a lot of different procedures and exceptions and variations to those procedures. So for the purpose of these slides, these are basically the sort of the basic public notice requirements, but the code does definitely have some variations for that. So I'll start with the written notice. The code requires that within 14 days of the staff making a determination of completeness, that we send out a notice of application. The notice, again, our code lists a list of contents that are required, but these include, and I included just some of the basic ones, the location and the description of the project, the date, time, and place of public hearing. If we know it at the time that we send the notice, the code does allow us to, if we don't know the date of the public hearing, to send another notice later. Actually, the example that I grabbed on the screen was one where we hadn't determined the date and time for that public hearing yet. But then that notice of application also includes a statement of the right for the public to comment and participate in that public hearing. And this goes out through one of our three methods of notifying the public of these hearings. This would be through the mail, and it is required to be sent to all property owners within 300 feet of the subject property. And then the other two methods that we use are actually posting the site and using the newspaper. And I've got a slide, I think, for each one of those methods next. So as far as posting the site goes, our code does specify the requirements for the notice board on the site. Requires one notice board to be posted per site. Code does allow us to request additional postings if the property doesn't have public street frontage, or it has multiple frontage, or there's some way that staff determines the need for additional signs to be adequate notice. The signs have to be visible and readable, and the code does have things like, posting it near the midpoint of the site's frontage, 5 feet from the property line, not getting the top of the sign any higher than 7 or 9 feet above grade. And it does have to be maintained in good condition from the time that it's posted, no later than 21 days prior to the public hearing, all the way through to the city's final decision, which includes appeal periods and possible appeals and resolution of those appeals. So it has to be visible, in good condition, and in place from 21 days through the final decision. And then that third method for providing public notice is using the newspaper. It is published in the Daily Record, and that's no less than 14 days prior to the public hearing. Has a lot of the same kinds of information that are in the other notices: the location, description, the type of permits, the deadline for comments. Again, that's run in the Daily Record. And then, so after a decision is made, there's another, for a lot of applications, there is another step of notice, and this is the notice of that decision. It does get mailed to the parties of record, which those include the applicant, people who submitted written comments, and people who provided testimony at the public hearing. So there is a way that there is a feedback to people who did participate in the hearing and were parties of record. And then we also have the requirement that notice of decision be posted on the site and published in the Daily Record, similar to those other notifications that I just discussed. So again, just a way where public notice is provided after the decision, let people know how it turned out.
Thank you. Any questions for Dan?
I guess I had one question. I should know this, but on the notice board requirements, is the responsibility to post, does that rest with the applicant, or is that internal city?
Yeah, it does with the applicant. The code says that the city provides basically an 11 by 17 that then the applicant has to enlarge to, I think it's 2 by 3 feet.
Okay. Yeah, I
and
thought that was
post on the site.
Okay. Thank you.
So the moral to the story is council generates a lot of work for staff. Your land use decisions come with a lot of rules and regulations and steps. Okay, thank you. Excellent. So I wanted to talk briefly about the equity lens, and simply put, an equity lens is to basically look at a policy, plan, program, or project with the sense of who might this potentially negatively impact. And so that might be a neighborhood or a group of people. And it's asking those questions really throughout a planning project. As we start, we often have a plan about how we're going to do a project or progress through a project plan. But oftentimes that changes. And if we continue to ask questions about how does this impact, this group? How does this impact this neighborhood? And making sure that we're asking those questions and adapting our plans and our process so that we don't end up at the end of the day with a project or a plan or a program that's going to negatively impact some group. And so and you all know this, your policies all come with trade-offs, and always thinking about what those are and making sure that you're aware of those when you're making complex decisions about issues. And so the equity lens, again, is really questions, and I included these actually came from AWC, from a program that they provided several months ago, I believe. And it's asking about, as a policymaker, making sure you're asking your staff the questions about, okay, how do we know this does not negatively impact someone? And asking your staff questions again throughout the planning project or process about impacts to different communities or different peoples in our communities. So as we look at our communications and engagement plans, again, we typically start with, okay, what are our goals? We know that the cost or the budget is sometimes driving what ability we have. And again, as Ellie mentioned, oftentimes our surveys are informal surveys. Which do you prefer? How do you access this service? They're general questions and meant to just get a general read of sort of community members' perceptions of different issues or different places sometimes as well. And so, but the more scientific we become we want a standardized scientific survey that's representative of our community so we can drive. That's when we get into the institutional review boards, into the standardized processes. And there's a lot of science that goes behind the questions that we ask and the order that we ask in them, and a protection to all of the information essentially as it's delivered out to the community and then analyzed in follow-up as well. So again, mentioned, sometimes we have lots of timelines. We have 14 different boards and commissions, and sometimes one or two or three of those boards and commissions might review a single policy. That all takes time in planning, in communications as well. So so making sure, again, we're thinking through what our goals are and timelines as well, and our budget in order to meet our goals. And as Ellie mentioned, methodology matters. How we protect and deliver the processes really impacts the results that we get and the ability to generalize the results into, well, we feel pretty confident that our community feels this. Oftentimes when we talk about when we offer up surveys, for instance, or polls to folks, oftentimes we'll get people on sort of each end of the spectrum, people that might feel very strongly in one way or another way about an issue, and those tend to be those groups. And so again, the scientific process tries to get to the broader community and make sure you're getting sort of that entire spectrum of people and of potential interests in the community. Great. And obviously, as Dan talked about, there's a regulatory requirement for some of our processes. So as we mentioned in the beginning, some of the challenges when it comes to communications and community engagement, in social media, when we deliver things on social media, it doesn't mean they get to all the people. Our Twitter or X, I guess it is, or Facebook, they determine the algorithms determine how it gets delivered to people's feeds and who it gets delivered to. The more it gets shared, oftentimes the more it gets out. But if we have links in posts, Facebook does not like links. And so again, we have to be cautious about how we construct our posts and our and communications to make sure to use those algorithms. And there's always the opportunity to pay for ads and things like that. And so again, so there are things that are outside of our control, trying to get information out to people or get people to interact with planning or other projects. And again, the competition for users' attention is always one. There is what the standard used to be. You need to get information in front of someone at least 7 times before they pay attention. It's sort of a marketing standard. And so, a one-time mailing doesn't always get people's attention. And so in trying to find, again, where people are and get something in front of them in order to have them be aware or interact or engage. Is really important. And then we also know that telling our own story is incredibly important, but that, we try to do so in a timely manner. And the rule used to be, if you don't tell it, somebody else will. And so we want to make sure to help people have reliable information coming from the city so that they can always trust that and they can refer back to that. And then again, our resources are often, limited. We don't have unlimited resources we have one PIO. Everybody in our organization communicates, but there's some standards that we try to follow for best practices. And again, it's more and more challenging making sure that we get facts out in front of folks and create reliable places for people to go. So there is, if there's misinformation, that we can correct that and help people go to a place or know where to ask questions. So over the last few years, there's always I always believe in the fail forward philosophy that, when we make mistakes or failures, we can learn from those and continue to move on. And so, communications it's never going to be perfect. And so one of the things that we've talked about, I guess, is that when we start out with a plan, oftentimes it evolves. I mean, something changes and we have to adapt. If we say we're going to do these 10 steps and when we get to step 6, we didn't have engagement or we didn't have the right people at the table. And so oftentimes we need to go back and correct and continue to move forward. And so the best laid plans are generally malleable. And making sure that we're using the right tool for the right job. We're asking the right questions. And again, back to the equity lens is just who does this impact and what might we not know? And as we discover who an issue might impact, making sure that we're addressing those issues as we move through. And then again, one of the things we've talked with at council is, we have folks who stand up sometimes and provide public comment, whether it's on a non-agenda item or during a public comment, and making sure that we're circling back in a formal way to make sure that we're answering people as well. And we talked a little bit about exercising equity principles and then continuing to inform through different channels. There is no one place. If I wanted to get to a message to everyone in the community, unless we pinged cell phones, which that may not either be effective because there are still people without cell phones. There's no one method that gets to everyone. So we have to really break up our communications and try to get messages out to people in a number of different ways, not just social media, not just the newspaper, and continue to wrap our communications and strategies so we can inform people and have people engage in different things. And the one thing we also know is that we do need to improve, work on our emergency communication systems specifically. And we'll talk about more another day. And then making sure that we're posting surveys and results, even, to informal surveys, that those are in front of folks so they know where to go look for those. One of the issues that's come up recently is, the city platforms are really essentially used for city speech. So when we do planning projects and things like that are asking for feedback, generally we aggregate the results. Sometimes we'll have people provide very specific public comment. We don't post those because again, the city platform is for city speech. Those are generally aggregated or summarized into the process instead of posted separately. So the city website isn't a forum essentially for anybody to get something posted on. So there's a little protection in that process. And then again, try to protect the integrity of the results through education. Again, surveys are not votes. They're just a way to help inform council. You all have very difficult decisions to make sometimes and that are very complex. And there are a number of different factors and people and groups that you need to hear from and then sometimes make really, really tough decisions. And so surveys can sometimes be just a data point that helps inform you of what people are thinking at the time. All right. And again, we have a number of different tools that we use to communicate out to folks. We have lists, and I know Nicole, when during our April 1st study session, she showed people how to sign up for those lists. I know she's here tonight. If people wanted a demonstration, we could probably do that. But making sure that we have tools on our website that if you want all of the city council minutes or all of the notices of boards and commissions, they're very specific lists you can sign up for. Those will come right to either your text or email, and all you have to do is sign up. So continuing to help people know where to go for information and sign up to get it. We're always here. People can always call City Hall and we'll connect them with that resource as well. So any questions? And here's the QR codes if anybody wants those from council or comments.
Okay, thank you.
Well, just since we have a couple minutes, maybe just how and when are we going to talk about the comprehensive plan public engagement process?
So our planning staff, our plan is due in 2026. Our planning staff are starting to work on the initial phases of that. And one of the first items they will bring to you is the public participation plan. So that will be an opportunity for you to look at what the plan is, to look at that very comprehensive overhaul over the next couple of years. And that could change too. Just keep in mind that's the plan starts out, but we might find that we need more engagement in some areas. So soon would be the short answer.
Okay.
Any further questions? Okay, we're going to conclude the study session and we will reconvene at 1900 hours for the regular city council meeting.